I will surrender my position as the empress. Chapter 2. Rather than a powerless empress, a loved lover is better. The only person who could freely open all of the imperial palace's gates arrived at the appropriate time. Diane's maids were responsible for quickly carrying out Diane's orders to rush to the emperor and request assistance as soon as the Grand Duchess arrived. Diane's forlorn expression deepened as Emperor Karl made his entrance. "Your Majesty." Karl's expression stiffened in response to the trembling voice that seemed it could disappear at any moment. Having the most powerful person in the country succumb to her call and react to her distressed face is a sight to witness. Diane's delicate eyes were met with Karl's piercing gaze. Elizabeth sighed and shook her head in relief. "Are you here to look for your concubine instead of running the state?" Tears welled up in Diane's eyes. "There is no doubt in the Duchess's words, and I keep saying, Your Majesty's future is impeding." Karl frowned and released a stifled breath in response to her remarks. Then, he glared ferociously at his sister and replied coldly, "Please stop bothering me. I can't sleep, and I'm upset. I'll return to my estate after the wedding." The emperor turned and exited the room. Diane was quick to follow him. Elizabeth sagged in her seat, staring at the door through which the two had vanished. Her anger intensified as though she had ingested fire. She inhaled deeply while pressing her chest. She remembered what Diane had said previously. His Majesty is the sun. The more light you receive, the closer you are to him. Do you have to go against His Majesty's will? Even if you are his sister, I am his one and only moon. The former empress's son, who was only a few months old, died before ascending to the throne. She never had another son after that. As a result, Elizabeth's father, the former emperor, fathered a child from their maidservant. His name was Karl Ulrich. Elizabeth's fists were clenched. If there had been another prince besides Karl, he would not have become emperor. However, Karl's flaws had little impact on his political position because he had no other adversary. Diane gently caressed Karl's hair. As he lay on her lap, Karl's eyes closed. It was due to the drowsiness that seemed to be gathering in her slender hands. Diane lowered her gaze to his stunningly beautiful face. "Karl Ulrich Echmont," she says. Even his name was perfect. Diane's hand, which was carefully brushing Karl's hair, slowed, and eventually stopped. Karl, who had been experiencing a languid sensation in his head, opened his eyes. He saw Diane was staring blankly into the distance. Her lips were red, and so were her eyes. When Karl noticed this, he stood up and faced her. "Diane." When Diane heard his low voice, she quickly came to her senses and apologized. Yes. Please accept my apologies." Diane's beautiful eyes welled up with tears. She didn't say anything, as tears streamed down her cheeks. "What if I irritate the Empress? Will you despise me?" The woman cried with clouded eyes and spoke as if pleading, while the Emperor responded with a stoic expression. "You will not be harmed by the Empress. You can't abandon me. Please don't abandon me, Your Majesty. All I require is Your Majesty. Please don't say that. You can't abandon me. Do not abandon me, Your Majesty." Diane repeated those words like a spell several times more. Diane Poitiers oversaw the preparations for Emperor Karl Ulrich's wedding. Diane Poitiers left no detail untouched, from the Empress's gown to her coffin. The nobles shook their heads, but no one dared bring up the subject. The Emperor's half-sister, Elizabeth Ulrich Grand, was the only woman in the current Ulrich imperial family, but she was divorced. Divorced women were not allowed to take control of marriages because divorce was considered taboo in the empire. But Diane Poitiers didn't look like she was wasting time getting ready for the wedding, so the nobles just observed and watched. "You have a strong stomach." Diane's fine brow furrowed in response to the glum tone. She shifted her attention to the maids, examining them intently. Her eyes then remained fixated on a single person. Today is my first time seeing you. Raise your head. Diane's order prompted the maid to slowly raise her head. Soft blonde hair, rather dark blue eyes, and off-white, but not overly so. Diane, who had been looking at the maid for a moment, turned her gaze and spoke in a cold tone. Everyone leave for a while. I'd like to have a moment with my brother, Diane commanded as the maids rushed out, her gaze fixed on her brother, Count Lennox Poitiers. I'd say that blondes with blue eyes shouldn't be left as maids. How do you choose a maid when there are so many blondes and blue eyes? Do as I say. Diane looked at his brother, and spoke clearly. Lennox shrugged and nodded at the end. Diane fiddled with the fabric swatch. It was the material used to make Karl's wedding robe. I think this is great material, Diane said, attempting to change the topic. Excellent speed. How did you decide on this? Lennox responded. Watch what you say in front of the maids. You can't come to me if you can't choose your word correctly. Let me ask you a question. Will you be able to endure once the Empress arrives? Diane leaned back in her chair and looked at her brother. The Emperor pretends to be unable to live without you, but he has not appointed you as Empress. Can you withstand the Empress's arrival? You don't even have kids, after all. He had spoken out of concern, but Lennox Poitiers's words pricked Diane Poitiers's chest. Diane was on the verge of throwing him out the door. She would have done so if it hadn't been for the imperial palace. Diane averted her gaze, forcing herself to calm down. She then picked up the items again and spoke coldly. Brother. Yes. Nothing from His Majesty will be tolerated by the Empress. What are you on about? I strongly object to the term, Empress. Do you get what I mean? After a brief moment of thought, the Count narrowed his eyes and refuted his sister's words. Whether you're hesitant or not, the title of Empress has significance in and of itself. It must be stated that she is an existence known as the Emperor. I mean, no one will betray His Majesty's love. No one can be above me as long as His Majesty loves me. Even the Duke of Despun tells me, His Majesty cannot appoint you as Empress, but he adores you. What kind of nonsense is that? Lennox muttered in disbelief, but Diane only snorted. Love is icy, Diane, he said, it will cool down someday. I know. No. Diane gave a sly grin. Love for a living person becomes icy. However, love for a deceased person never fades. As a result, death appears to be an immortal name. Diane sighed and removed the locket from around her neck. When she opened the locket's lid, there was a portrait of a familiar, slender woman who resembled Diane. Her pale sky blue eyes and curly blonde hair. The woman in a locket portrait was Karl Ulrich's late mother. Karl sees his mother in me. The Empress is nowhere important to him. Have you forgotten how strained the relationship was between the former Empress and the current Majesty? A concubine with both love and power is preferable to an Empress with only a title. Diane smiled as she closed her eyes and clasped the locket in her hands. How are you going to get along with the Empress? Do you have any idea what kind of woman she is? I told you to get pregnant before the Emperor's wedding. Diane finally became enraged. She then closed her eyes and swallowed her anger. She opened her eyes and spoke in a controlled manner. It makes no difference. The Count murmured and raised his brows. What are you on about? Because she was born a princess, everyone must have bowed their heads in front of her and supported her. Her people must have elevated her to the status of a princess. The gaze and hospitality of those around them shape people. I can make even the poorest beggar feel like a king. How? All you have to do is get a lot of people to bow their heads in front of the beggars. Those on the road will then bow their heads to beggars as well. Diane sighed and lifted the cloth again, her face irritated by Lennox's words. In any case, it doesn't matter who she is. She won't have anyone to push her to greatness. What would a foreign country's princess do? She'll come and go across the sea to ask for help. About a month later, knights on horseback lined up in front of the capital's gates, which boasted the great majesty. They felt the fierce spirit while wearing the dignified black cloak. It was the end of summer, the wide plain was ablaze with vibrant wildflowers and the sun shone brightly overhead. The golden sunlight and the colorful wildflowers swaying in the wind were stunning. Dozens of black-cloaked knights waited for someone to appear from beyond the beautiful plains. How long has it been? The person standing in front and looking into the distance narrowed his eyes slightly. Lionel Balder, Minister of Defense Echmont and commander of the Guards Division, sported dark hair and blue eyes. He is a direct descendant of the venerable Prince Balder. As they would be welcoming the next Empress of Echmont, he was selected as the representative. Lionel fixed his gaze on the distant silhouette that appeared at the horizon's edge. It appears that they're on their way. Someone said to Lionel in a cheerful tone, possibly also to the other knights. I noticed. Let's get out there soon. When Lionel lightly waved the reins, the horse began cantering, and the knights behind him drove the horse in unison as a signal. At the sound of thumping hooves, the birds resting under the trees were startled and flew away into the sky. Adele, who had grown tired from riding in the carriage, stood up and looked out the window when she heard horseshoes shake the ground. It was rather enjoyable to hear. A group of knights happened to be running at the same time. Her patience was about to run out after spending nearly 2 months on ships and wagons. Adele asked the person who was leading the horses. How far do we have to go? What you're looking at now is the first gate. We have to go through gate 2, which adds about an hour to our journey. 1 hour. She paused for a moment before closing the window that had been open the entire time and drew the curtains down. Adele grinned as she pulled a pair of her own clothes from her box as her maid looked at it in amazement. I should change my clothes. The wagon's speed gradually slowed as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder by the minute. Adele stood up and looked at the door when the carriage came to a complete stop. From outside the wagon, they could hear each other greeting each other, and then they felt someone approaching the wagon. A low-pitched voice was heard at the same time as a polite knock. Do you mind if I open the door? It was a powerfully moving voice. Adele opened the carriage door herself instead of responding. The first thing she noticed when she opened the door was a mysterious blue light. Adele paused for a moment, thinking, how strange and beautiful. Meanwhile, Lionel, who was standing outside the carriage, took a step back, surprised by the sudden opening of the door. She drew the curtains tighter and stepped out of the carriage, her gaze fixed on him, with orbs of bright gold color that gleamed even in the carriage's dim interior. He didn't realize he had been staring at Adele intently until she stepped out of the carriage. Lionel extended his hand quickly and politely and Adele placed her hand lightly on his. Adele had just taken his hand and was walking down the stairs when the wind blew. Lionel's jet black hair fluttered in the wind and ran across his cheeks. The weight on his hand vanished as he turned his gaze to follow her hair tickling his cheek. The princess of another country stood on her ground, staring at him silently.